arises. And I'd never place the blame only on a rating agency. We as investment banks originating these types of loans also want the best ratings for our product and do whatever we can to make them rating worthy. But at the end of the day, a true assessment of risk and a really good underwriting of risk, I think is what will continue to differentiate rating agencies. Just wanted to provide.
Let me add one brief comment. I think one of the most striking failures of rating agencies was illustrated in the fact that they gave an excellent rating to Lehman Brothers just before it crashed. This Lavanya and others mentioned, even Rohan mentioned about the conflict of interest. Conflict of interest is well established. There can be serious issues of conflict of interest. But my submission to you is that apart from conflict of interest, there are also very serious issues of competence and capability. Let me explain my point. I'll just take a minute to explain. When you are rating, you are looking at the normal distribution curve. You're not, in the language of risk management, you're not looking at the possibility of what are called outliers. You're not looking at tail end events. I think there's a professor from Harvard, I'm not sure, but about 3 years, just before the crisis, he wrote an excellent book on what is called, and that word has become evocative, colorful, it has been picked up all over the world, black swan. Black swan. So, you have to look at the possible. Just because something has not happened, you cannot extrapolate on that basis and say Lehman Brothers has never defaulted in the past 150 years. But does it give you any comfort that going forward it will not default? Going forward it will not fall like a house of cards. So even these things have been built into this concept of risk management, the concept of outlier, the concept of tail end event, and there is a real and distinct and worrisome possibility of a black swan emerging anywhere at any time. So these things also need to be factored in for a comprehensive and a holistic assessment of the totality of the situation. That is the basic one. So I think with this we'll throw open. We are running well into the time schedule given to us, so we still have about 20 odd minutes. So with your permission, ladies and gentlemen, we'll throw open the discussion to the House, and I request any of you, if any, please raise your questions, mention your name, and please make your question sharp and pointed, and because we have constraints of time, and please mention the name of the panelist to which you want to address the question. With this, it's all yours.
Good afternoon, sir. My question is to Dr. Sharma. So my taking up from the incentive point that Ms. Lavanya spoke, I would like to link it to financial inclusion in India. So you also in the morning touched briefly upon incentivizing banking correspondence. So in terms of say mutual funds or insurance, what more improvements do you want to see with regard to incentivizing channels? Because the way SEBI has moved in the mutual fund industry, it has actually disincentivized distributors to distribute mutual funds. On the contrary, you see mutual insurance products, because of the high incentives which are provided on your normal endowment plans, the basic term insurance product is not that popular. So do you want to see any improvement on the way incentives are distributed among the channels which distribute financial products?
It's actually, if I may just correct you on what you say, what you said was right. The first part of your argument or your question was absolutely right, that SEBI had. It is slightly in the past, SEBI had and disincentivized, because their idea was simple, that if you were dealing with the investment community, you have to first think about the investment community at large. So they thought about the investors who were having to pay those lump sum entry loads of 2.25% and so on. Now the fact that remains is, if you looked at markets during 2004 to 2008, when they were doing exceptionally well, there was no problem for any investor to pay the 2% entry load. right? Even if they had to do it, let's say, multiple number of times in the year. But from post 2008 onwards, when markets became a different ballgame altogether, right? The fact that somebody had to pay that 2% despite the fact that he was not making any kind of a return was what was questionable under SEBI's domain. So that's the reason they went ahead and disincentivized, so to speak, because they took away that entry load. Having said that, there were two things that they did. Their concept was very clear that we don't want somebody, because of a financial incentive, to go and churn an investor's portfolio multiple number of times in the year, something that was happening significantly across the industry. What they rather said was, you remove the entry load and make the entry load a point of discussion between the investor and the advisor. So if the advisor can tell the investor or can showcase to the investor that there is enough value add that he is doing, he can charge any amount. It need not be even 2%, it will be even more than 2% for all of you know. But it has to be very clearly communicable to the to the investor that there is value add that is happening in that process, and not just a mere churning of the portfolio. That's point one. In continuation with this, what they also did was they said that, okay, if I'm taking the entry load away from this process, I would lump it up with a larger trail commission, which would be paid off to the investment advisory firm for the number of years that the investor stays put in that investment. So again, promotion on the basis of which one is not forced to churn, or not rather incentivized to churn. So as long as you keep on continuing in the same fund over a longish period of time, you keep on earning your trail commissions. The idea there is very clear that you as an investment advisor need to build your book, increase your wallet share from clients individually and collectively, and build the business in the right manner. That's point one. Point two, now coming to the point as to where it is today. Just about, I think, 2 weeks back, SEBI has come up with a bit of a clarification on this point that you're mentioning. What they have done is they have improvised on the expense ratio which the fund manager was able to earlier charge to the fund, and instead of the original 1.7, 1.8%, they have now hiked it up to about 2%. So 30 bps has been the thing. Provided there is a condition there as well. We were talking about financial inclusion in the morning. Provided that the investment has come from areas outside the top 15 cities, which largely contribute to the mutual fund business in the country today. So if the investment comes from beyond the top 15 cities, then you can go ahead and extra charge the 30 paisa to the fund as another extra additional expense ratio. The other thing that SEBI has also done is, earlier they had very clear demarcations in terms of how much in upfront commission, how much in trail, and how much overall as an expense ratio and so on. Now they have made that entire concept fungible, dependent on the mutual fund house as to how much they want to pay to the advisor, who's going, or the distributor who's going ahead and distributing their fund. So to say that it's being disincentivized is slightly off the mark, so to speak. I hope I've answered your question.
Can I just add to it? Another point you mentioned about is a comparison between the insurance and mutual fund industry. Right? In fact, you see that you're right that till certain months back, ULIP, which was being sold at a as a 1 point product by the insurance agency. So there's a famous saying, if you want to go and buy an insurance policy, you will always buy a term insurance. If somebody sells it to you, it is never a term insurance, right? So, but if you see that the authority, the IRDA has come back very hard on and they have planned the ULIP sales, etc. So one of the points which Arijit was making, and I'm coming back to the same point when we started the discussion, right? About regulations. At the end of the day, what has happened is that the insurance companies had tried to sell the insurance as a product, which will do a wealth creation for you instead of actually providing an insurance. While on the other hand, mutual fund house also is saying that we will do a wealth creation for you. But if you see the regulations for both of these are completely different. So an insurance policy insurance can be marketed by a celebrity like Amitabh Bachchan, etc., but a mutual fund house can't do that, right? There are a lot of such differences which are there. And I'm coming back to that regulation. The point of regulation is that if you see after 2008 meltdown in US and UK, the authorities have set up different regulatory bodies which now focus on customer as a priority and not the fund house or the insurance company. Because what happens in India today is that we are working on the concept of the customer should be aware. So if the customer is signing a form, he should be aware what he's signing. The customer is, when he's giving a check or filling a form for a fund house or for insurance, he should be aware of what he is signing on. But if you look at even the smartest investors in India, you really don't have time to kind of go through the entire terms and conditions, so you basically it leads to mis-sell. So what there is a point of view, and that's a thought process which is coming in, is that in India too, you should also go towards a situation wherein you are actually considering the customer as a center point and build the policies around it. It should not be assuming that the customer is aware, and it should not be, you should not try to spend so much of, you're spending so much of money on a customer awareness. That's something which is not really going to yield any results, because even at the topmost level, there is still, so much of lack of knowledge about the financial products. So obviously, if you go down to the third strata, fourth strata of the society, nothing is going to happen. So obviously, people are going to be in trouble when they invest into the product. So that's the point which.
Just to add on to what Sushil is saying, there's one more point that one has to keep in mind. Sometime in 2008-9, when SEBI actually came out with the thing that we don't want to have any kind of entry loans, they went about it over a 3-month period. So one fine morning in June, July, they decided that by 4th September, no entry loans are going to be banned. Just to take a case in point, which in terms of FSA that he was referring to in the UK, FSA had decided something similar as well, but they had given the advisory entity 3 years of time to kind of gradually go through that kind of a process. That is something which SEBI had missed out on when it came to, because you don't create the back end, you don't create the point of being able to provide for the livelihood of so many of these millions of advisors across India, and you just go ahead and say, okay, boss, from tomorrow morning we are going to stop this, and it's going to get into a new regime altogether. That's something which SEBI had missed out at that point in time. Something that we need to learn from these overseas agencies when they handle such kind of transition over a phase manner.
I must say both Arijit and Sushil are far more knowledgeable and competent in this area than I am, so they have adequately answered the question. But just to touch on the brief aspect of financial inclusion. Financial inclusion, the issue of incentives has come up in a big way. Basically, as we see, this incentivization has to occur at 2 levels. One at the level of individuals, the other at the level of institutions also. Because so far, may not say it publicly, I cannot say it with the closed halls, not to be quoted publicly, it is a losing proposition. However, there are larger societal goals available, but in terms of a financial product, it is not a very attractive proposition for the banks. But here, I'd like to draw attention, there is a very powerful book by one fellow person from Karnataka, published I think 2007, Professor C.K. Prahlad, died recently, emeritus professor at Harvard, Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid. Those of you who might not have read, I would strongly urge, I strongly suggest, please go through it. It makes a very compelling case and provides, in some ways, a very strong theoretical and empirical justification for the case of financial inclusion. Maybe something could be thought of, and ultimately, at the end of the day, there could be a pot of gold for everyone. But the pot of gold will take some time coming. So, all of us have to be patient in the process. Thank you. Next question.
My name is Mayank, I am from BJP1, and my question is to Dr. Sharma. Certain banks have been asking RBI to remove the concept of CRR totally. So, what's your take on this?
It's a very difficult question. I think you might have been aware of the comment, which is sometimes seen as a funny comment made by Dr. Subbarao recently. Recently, there's a conference on buyback. Quickly, and IPA was held at Mumbai just about 10 days back. So he prefaced his opening remarks to the conference by saying that I have taken a very serious policy decision. That I have decided to set up a committee, and 2 opposing partners, Pradeep Chaudhary, Chairman SBI, and Dr. K.C. Chakravarti, Deputy Governor, and they will be locked in a room till they come to a decision. And the time frame for them taking the decision is that not till the time I retire. So, but banks have a strong claim that basically what happened is that if you look at things in a proper historical and comparative perspective, I come from a commercial bank, so I have some idea of this mechanism of CRR, that till 2007, I think, banks were paid by RBI on this CRR balance. From 2007 or maybe 2008, I think 2007 onwards, RBI has stopped paying. This is the impounding, what is to, if I may use a stronger word, is statutory preemption of funds by the RBI. And then it's a huge sum. Earlier it was 4.75, now it has been brought to 4.75. For example, if you take in case of Canara Bank, we have deposits of something of the extent of about maybe 3,25,000 crore. So 4.55% of this funds is a huge sum for any institution. You can just work out how many crores it works out to, and we are not getting any returns. Further, our cost of funds has consistently, the cost of which, so it has a very negative impact on our profitability, on our bottom line, our ability to pursue societal goals like microfinance, like financial inclusion. So the banks do have a case. And another point is that sometimes this CRR instrument is used that the official justification could be that it can be seen as some kind of a hedge, that when banks were to fail, this would come as a handy mechanism. But in India, there is very little fear, and especially absolutely no fear of a public sector bank going down and under. The situation here is dramatically different from that of other countries. For example, even in case of public sector banks, there is a parliament resolution to the effect that in no case, even in the worst scenario kind of a thing, government holding will not come below the level of 51%. For example, if you take our case, we had earlier government holding to the extent of 72%. Last year, we raised some money through what is called the QIP option, Qualified Institutional Placement Route. We raised some 2,000 crores. The government holding has come down, but still it is at a very healthy 67%. Broadly, this is the position of almost all public sector banks. So there is absolutely no danger of any public sector bank collapsing. So to take the kind of position that some people do, that this could be used as some kind of an hedging instrument, as a hedging mechanism, that were banks to go down under, were banks to fail, to collapse, that argument is, to my mind, at least a little misplaced and not entirely based on facts.
I'm Ravi Bihani. My question is to Mr. Rohan. You told the auditors, and the auditors give you the report, and you give the credit rating to for the company or for the agencies. Now, if suppose you are giving a are you doing anything to curb down? If some auditor gives you some wrong report, something like what happened in Satyam, the PwC people, they gave the wrong report as given by Mr. Raju. So at the end they were caught and all the money went out. So is there anything that you are trying to curb down with the auditor's report and the agency, credit ratings they are providing? Or you are certain is it providing the same right auditing or not?
What we can do is we can do our own due diligence and trace facts from various sources instead of making it one source. Auditor's report is just one source. We also take feedback from all the bankers, the customers, and their other clients as well. So based on this, we come to an approach. Now, if everything is cooked, then I don't know what we could do. At least in the case of Satyam, it was so well managed by Mr. Raju, no one ever found out. So in such a case, as a rating agency, we cannot do anything in that kind of a scenario. At least I'm not aware of anything that we have done.
Part of the question, isn't there any physical verification mechanism available by which you can physically verify a few times in a financial year that what the company is, the company's report that the company providing that is actually there or not, the assets are actually there or not?
No, that is an auditor's work. The credit rating agency would not verify.
The auditors actually certified cash on the bank, which didn't exist. In case of Satyam, the auditors had certified cash on the FDs in the bank, which didn't exist. So obviously the rating agencies can't really verify what the auditor actually verified. then it's a it's a dual work. So I mean, if your question is
External
about
audit is
sampling,
always-
then that's something maybe Rohan can throw light on. But otherwise, the job function itself is not there. I mean, that's not the job function of it.
You think that that to verify auditor's job and the rating agency just gives the auditors.
See, that's what I'm saying. So if there is a sampling, if there a sampling which happens, if that's your question, then maybe Rohan can throw
No,
some
sir,
light
there
on
is
it.
no such sampling, see, because we do so many credit ratings, it is not possible for us to go and look at your assets and then do a valuation. See, for the valuation, there is a separate team, they are the valuators. For the auditing, there is a separate team, they are the chartered accountants. For every function in finance, there is a team that provides you facts and figures. Now, we start doing their work, who will do our work? Yeah. So we can only do and go as per the facts that we have got, and like I mentioned, one thing we can do is instead of raising facts from one source, we can do it from multiple sources. So we try to cover the entire gamut of business. We speak to the customers, we speak to the suppliers, we speak to all the bankers, we would speak to the top management. If there is any discrepancy in any of these and they don't match, then we can come to a consensus. But if everything is completely cooked, then the external agency is totally helpless. And I don't know of anything that an external agency can do.
That
Just
can
to
could
add on
become
to-
a black swan event kind of a thing.
Just to add on to what Rohan is saying, the kind of question that you're asking is actually not the job of the auditor. What typically happens in a branch banking network, it is the branch manager's job, and there are obviously checks and balances provided within the system so as to go and physically verify cash in another branch. Like for example, while I was working with HSBC at Fort, I was asked to, at least on 2 occasions, to go to Indore and physically verify what is the bunch of cash which is over there. So that's called branch balancing. That's, as a process, is followed by banks across, because that's something that they need to report to the RBI at the end of the day as to what is the cash balance and so on and so forth. So that definitely is not a job of the auditors, that is a job of the branch staff internally.
And apart from the audit report, the banker's report carries a lot of weight.
Yes, it
That's-
does.
That's a very
Yeah.
good fact that you have.
So what I think here is that there are processes, but the problem is with the implementation. Like if that the verification part from the